Welcome to another show. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. Today I have with me Miss Veronica Cruz. Miss Veronica Cruz has 17 years of experience working with children, adolescents, and families. She's a qualified expert witness in clinical and social work in numerous jurisdictions and courts in Maryland. She concentrates on cases revolving around illegal or harsh sentences, post-conviction relief, modification of sentences, the death penalty, and juveniles charged as adults. She is founder and CEO of Cruz and Associates LLC, which is a consulting firm that specializes in preparing comprehensive forensic psychosocial reports for criminal and civil matters, continuing education and psychotherapy. She is an adjunct professor with the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the show, Miss Veronica Cruz.
Thank you.
Glad
to be here.
Thank you so much. Before we even start, can you give out your web address so that people can have your web address so they can check you out online?
Yeah, so I have two. If you're interested in my criminal defense forensic side, I have www.cruzassociates.org. If you're interested in me coming in as a guest speaker or continuing education, you can go to www.veronicacruz.com.
All right, so just before we begin, can you give us a background on your education and your experience? I've read some of it, but can you let the people know what school you went to and your degrees and everything?
Yeah, so I have, I identify myself primarily as an emergency room hospital social worker. I have a bachelor's degree from Catholic University in psychology. I have a master's from Maryland. I have an advanced forensic certification from Maryland. I did about 14 years in the emergency room. I did inpatient, outpatient, PHP. I have been in the forensic field. Specifically, I worked with the Office of the Public Defender. Then I went solo. So I have extensive experience working both in the mental health field in terms of the hospital setting, private practice, and also in the legal field under different jurisdictions. And I travel for different cases depending on what they are, whether they're local or they're death penalty cases. So I kind of couple all of that together, and then I teach advanced ethics at Catholic University, and I teach advanced trauma at the University of Maryland.
Okay, advanced trauma. What is advanced trauma? What is that about?
So I think that it's important to differentiate that, because you have trauma that's just in terms of for children, for adolescents, and then you have really a culmination of that. So the advanced version is sort of, we don't hold back. We talk about all different types of trauma, and really breaking them down conceptually, what they are, how do you treat them, what do they look like. So a more in-depth, more skill-based course that really dives into the different forms of trauma that there are.
Okay, so let me just say a little bit about myself. So at the age of 17, I committed attempted murder too, and I was sentenced to 20 years, right? Growing up, now that I'm 43 years old, I just reflect back and just think about the things that I witnessed and the things that I saw. And now dealing with a therapist, she has told me that those things were trauma, right? So seeing guys murdered, right? Seeing someone or seeing two people laid out on the ground that has been shot in the head, would that be considered, well, of course it's trauma, but I guess what I'm getting at is when I was sentenced, I had nobody there to bring this out and talk to the judge and maybe not really justify my actions, but give an understanding on why I thought the way that I thought and I carried myself the way I carried myself. Are these the type of cases that you typically deal with?
Yeah, so I specialize specifically, I'm a mitigation specialist. So when individuals commit first degree murder, first degree rape, I'm brought in, and I'm glad you said that, not to excuse the charges, but to sort of understand how we got here.
Okay.
To understand and to see the individual, that they're not the sum totality of the worst action they committed. So I'm brought in to essentially tell someone's story, and in that, what I've realized, and I've been doing criminal defense now for 14 years, there hasn't been a single case that I've touched that hasn't had some element of trauma in it. And oftentimes, I'm the first individual informing my clients that it's trauma, informing the family that it's trauma, because it becomes so normalized. They think, well, this is the way that it was. And I'm like, because it's like that doesn't mean that it's not traumatic.
Right.
Doesn't mean that it didn't have an impact. Trauma starts shaping the brain at a very, very young age. So it's compounded trauma. Trauma on top of trauma. Individuals don't even recognize it oftentimes. So what you're saying is what the norm.
And it's crazy because like I would tell my therapist from time to time when I go in there and I get to unveiling some things, and I would tell her, like, to us, that's regular. That's our everyday life. Like somebody being shot or killed, or my cousin did, or my brother did, or my friends did. That's regular. And she's looking at me like, that's not regular. But for us that's living that type of environment, it's what we see every day. So we think that it's regular. And so from the clinical standpoint, how do you deal with this? Like, how do you deal with, I want to stay where you was at with the, as a child, how it's layered on layered, because I think that's important. Once I go back into my childhood, and I go all the way back as far as I can to, like, seeing people hit with baseball bats and that type of thing. How or what is your suggestion on how to deal with that type of trauma?
So I think the major thing is really understanding, and I'm going to call it, it's the trauma narrative. It's all of us have a trauma narrative because we all experience little t traumas or big T traumas.
Okay.
So the trauma narrative is sort of the story that encompasses what happened to you, right? So oftentimes the individuals have that story, but they don't share it. They don't digest it. They don't break it down. So it just becomes normalized. So I think the first thing to really do is really break down the trauma narrative. What happened, I'll give you an example. For individuals that have acute PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they can vividly recall smells, scent, vision, certain things they can vividly recall. Other individuals can, but they block it. So they're defense mechanisms. So the mind has an ability to be able to shut down certain images, certain ideas, so that you can process. A good example in which we see this often is with sexual abuse, especially if the perpetrator in the home is the abuser. The child still has to live within that home. They still have to play a role within that family. So if your father or your uncle or your brother's the one molesting you, but you have to sit down every day and have dinner with them, your mind learns to block off certain things. They're defense mechanisms. So in terms of how we help individuals at a really young age, first, you have to elicit that trauma narrative. Some individuals have suppressed that so much because that's the only way they know how to deal with life. So really the first thing we do is really pulling out what that trauma narrative is. But I will say this, and I will caution your viewers on this. When we are, eliciting that trauma narrative, one of the main things that you have to be very careful about is checking for someone's psychological stability. Okay. So if someone has been suppressing these thoughts, this trauma, and all of a sudden it comes out, you have to make sure that mechanisms are in place, coping mechanisms, so that when they reveal that, when they disclose or they start talking about that trauma, they're going to have individuals around them that are going to be able to support them. Because that's one of the main things. Oftentimes, individuals won't disclose whatever their trauma is, whether it's sexual, physical, psychological, because there's no one there to really help them, to catch them. So I think as we're exploring that, we just have to make sure. I always tell, I teach this all the time. I tell fellow clinicians this, I tell my students this. You should never, ever open a door that you're not willing to walk through with your client. So if I'm willing to help you elicit that trauma narrative, I need to sit there and help you as you're processing it, or we shouldn't open that door yet.
Okay.
So it needs to be, it can be very tricky, because for some individuals, you can further traumatize them if you open up that door too soon. Or they're not prepared to open it up.
Because I'm sitting here thinking I was the type that kept a lot of my trauma and stuff in, but again because I thought that it was normal. It was normal. Even the way that I was dealing with it, I thought it was normal. And I'm just sitting here thinking while you're talking about, you know, that you teach your students that they have to be willing to walk all the way through. Because for me, if I'm not comfortable with you, you're not gonna get nothing out of me. Like, I would sit there and look at you like, I'm good.
Yep.
I don't need any help. So in terms of practice, diagnosing, because you spoke before we came on air, you spoke about the different traumas. How do you? I forgot the numbers that you gave out. You said it was a new guideline out, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
So prior to going on air, we were talking about post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
And we were talking about sort of how we diagnose individuals. And there's different tools that we use. And I'll share them with your audience, and you can share them as well. Different assessment tools that we use. But just so that people understand, even within the clinical community, prior to we use a DSM-4. It's sort of our Bible on how we diagnose. So the DSM-4 was replaced in October 2017 with the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 came out, and again, that's the Bible. That's what we're supposed to refer to when we diagnose. This is the first time that we see post-traumatic stress disorder, which initially the way that it starts is it's acute stress disorder. So when individuals experience a trauma or traumas and they don't react a certain manner, or they're having difficulty reacting, assimilating back into life, we start with acute stress disorder. And then if it lingers for more than 6 weeks, then it moves on to post-traumatic stress disorder. Before the DSM-5 came out, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, was lumped under anxiety disorders. So it didn't have a chapter on its own. It wasn't really broken down in terms of the symptomology. But now with the DSM-5, PTSD stands on its own. That is significant. It is significant because even within the clinical community, I would see this for years. I can't tell you. I mean, I've worked on over 300 cases. I worked in emergency rooms. I saw reports. I saw medical records. I would see literally item by item, it was post-traumatic stress disorder. And at the end, it would say diagnosis, trauma history. But that's not enough. Clinically, that's not enough. Yes, it's a trauma history, but is it acute stress? Is it post-traumatic stress disorder? So the DSM-5 came, they actually separated post-traumatic stress disorder to allow clinicians to know that post-traumatic stress disorder is a legitimate diagnosis. We can diagnose clients with that, which is important because some insurance companies would not take PTSD. It had to be depression, it had to be anxiety, it had to be bipolar. So now that the clinical community is doing a lot of catch-up, what I see now, though, is if we're starting to catch up, some of us have caught up a long time ago, it's just, other half had it. What happens with the lay individual? Right. When they don't have any experience with that, when they don't know, when it's trauma on top of trauma, when they don't even recognize that it's trauma. Right. When they've experienced it. And we had talked earlier, it's sort of like even the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder. By definition, it's post-traumatic stress. For some individuals, there's nothing post about that trauma. They're living it day after day after day. So even the way that we classify it, so we're able to now diagnose individuals, and we have different assessment tools that we can give them. But I think for a lot of individuals, they just first have to realize that it's trauma. Okay. People don't realize that. I think that's one of the big things.
Is it possible to define trauma?
So trauma is, when I was thinking about that, sort of how would I define it? Because one of the things, I can give you some of the characteristics of trauma, which I think would be a little bit more. Trauma is universal. We all experience it. Okay. It's almost like comparable to if I put up a picture, right? Let's say I put up a picture of Salvador Dali. I love Salvador Dali for your audience, right? Salvador Dali, he has all these pictures with like clocks, right? Mm-hmm. So if I showed you this picture and it has all these clocks and all of us are looking at it, we're all going to be picking different aspects of that picture that resonate with us. because it's all about perception. It's all about the perspective that we want to take on that. Well, that's how trauma is. You can have two individuals in the same household experience the same type of physical, sexual, psychological abuse, but the two individuals are going to process it drastically different because they're looking at that painting as an example, and they're looking at different parts of it. So trauma is universal, but it manifests itself in individuals very differently. So you have small t traumas, you have big T traumas. It's very universal. It's difficult to sort of pin down. It is an event or a series of events that psychologically, emotionally, physically wounds the individual.
Okay, can you say that one more time?
It's an event or a series of events that psychologically, emotionally, physically wounds the individual.
Wow, and that's
so
trauma.
it's the wound concept of it. It leaves it. Think of it sort of like it's an onion effect. So you pull one layer off, then you have another, then you have another, and that's why a lot of individuals keep that onion, that trauma very close to them because they're not ready to open that up yet. But we all experience it.
Right.
So it's hard to pin it down, but if I had to, that's the best definition I could give you.
No, you gave a great definition, and it's kind of like it's really blowing my mind because I'm going back. Right now, stuff is just playing in my head, and I'm just like, dang, so that happened? That happened?
You're starting to make the connections.
Right. So it's like you say, trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And I can only imagine how many children in school right now, even in elementary school, has layers of trauma and trauma on top.
I want to address that. You said children, right? So one of the things that we see a lot in children is truancy, and when there's trauma involved. So truancy is children that don't go to school, that they miss a significant amount of period of time. I had a case, right? And we're going to I call out my clients Scott or Jane. So this is going to be Scott, right?
Okay.
Scott 1. Scott, when we pulled his school records, in elementary school, this kid had missed 40 days. 40 days. You're in the second grade and you're missing 40 days. So that truancy part, that not being in school, is really a manifestation of a much bigger problem, right?
Okay.
Because what it highlights is, one, that there's no supervision in the home, because someone's letting this child be 30, 40 days out of school. But also you have to think, so an individual, whenever, let's say that, you have anxiety and because there's something big that's happening and you have that feeling in the gut, the pit of your stomach, right? You're going to take an exam or something happens and you're walking around with that feeling. You know how to process that emotion, right? Okay. But for a child, if that feeling in the pit of your stomach is habitually there because your home is an environment of trauma, where does that go? So now we have kids sitting in class and we're demanding of them all these things academically, and they're still processing that emotion. They're still going through all these things. So I think when we're talking about kids, it's sort of like, are we picking up, we're demanding a lot of children, but are we demanding a lot of ourselves in terms of analyzing what's going on with children? Because if individuals walked around and they were not processing that trauma and they're walking around with that pit, and I don't know how else to explain it, but it's physiological. Anyone can relate to that. When you're stressed, when you're anxious, that feeling you get. Well, what if that feeling never goes away? What if that's what you're walking around with? Clinically, even just to begin to, that's the onion, that's the layer, that's the ripple effect.
And we talking about children.
And we're talking about children. But these children grow up and they become adults. And you know what they do? They learn to hide behind a facade that they put out. Some of some of the individuals that have the most complex trauma, you might never know that, because they put a facade and they know how to smile and they know how to present a certain way. And so that's why it's also hard to diagnose, because some individuals, especially, and clinically it's called affect regulation. Okay. So, and you've probably seen it, you just don't know this. It's an individual that will tell you a story and it's really traumatic and they're smiling or they're laughing. So their affect is not congruent to their emotions, but that's all trauma. So all of this is interconnected. So in the way that we see it is like, maybe there's, we don't diagnose it appropriately, or we don't recognize that it's trauma. Trauma is huge. It's embedded in every fiber of our culture. If I could just give you some examples, okay, of what trauma is, if I had to break down sort of, and I was making a list, and I at some point I just sort of stopped.
Okay.
Because there's so many. If I had to define like what are the different forms of trauma, but I want people to really understand how big this is, right? We have child abuse. There's physical, sexual, psychological. I mean, there's even just within the realm of child abuse, there's different layers to that.
Okay.
Then you have mass interpersonal violence. So this is a new category that we recently clinically added. We're talking about 9/11, so big mass attacks.
Okay.
Then you have natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis. You have large-scale transportation accidents, airplanes coming down. You have fires and burns, and we're talking about small scale. We're talking about in the homes. So this can be small or large. Motor vehicle accidents, that can be very traumatic to some clients. I mean,
if they went through it, or if they know somebody that...
Both, right? Because I have a client that I'm clinically working with right now. She's one of my therapy clients. She was hit by a bus. So now when she's driving, she would drive all the time. Now when she's driving, she says she starts tensing up because physiologically her body is responding to something that post already happened, but she's living it in the moment. And it's affecting her relationship with her daughter because she can't travel. There's so many things she can't do that she used to be able to do.
Gotcha.
But now, so it's even just witnessing it, being a part of it. So, and depending, what if you had casualties in that accident? So even within these, there's so many different examples embedded within them. Then you have rape and sexual assault. And within rape and sexual assault, you're also looking at in terms of incest. You're looking at rapes in terms of the, even though I do criminal offense, I'll say this, even from a legal justice perspective. If an individual is charged with first-degree rape and it's way down to a fourth-degree rape, you just re-victimize the victim.
Right.
So even from that aspect, then you have physical assault. You have intimate partner violence, which is huge in the community of color. You have sex trafficking, and we're now become one of the hubs for sex trafficking.
Maryland?
The DMV in general, because we have a lot of things that combine sex trafficking. We have major intersections. We have 270. We have 95. We have casinos. We have sporting events. We have national,
Gotcha.
international airports. So all that kind of goes into that. You have torture, war, witnessing homicide or suicide, even if people don't recognize it. And I want to say homicide and suicide because those are very different, and trauma-wise they're very different.
Okay.
You have life-threatening medical conditions, and even just conditions that aren't threatening but change your complete way that you used to live your life. You also have exposure from emergency room workers, like individuals that are going into the field. They go out there and they're seeing all these atrocities and all this trauma, and who's checking for them for their traumatization, right? And then you have immigration. Oh, I could go on and on immigration, but I have a vested interest in that. But immigration, the traumas related to that. You have incarceration, which I'm sure we'll get to, poverty, addiction, mental illness, neighborhoods, and so on and so on. Those are just so people can sort of understand. And I held back. There's still even more, but just sort of what trauma is. So when you ask me to define it, it's
right.
It's so many things.
And so I'm just thinking, I'm all the way, my mind somewhere else right now. So someone said they said a psychological assessment should be required in the school system to recognize it immediately. How could you speak to that?
So I think and individuals that work in certain jurisdictions are going to understand this. So we win cases because we get medical records, we get school records. And the sad thing about school records is I can look at school records and I can tell you for the most part with almost 90 to 100% certainty, I can tell you what school district they came from. That's sad. Because if it's comprehensively done, it's usually Montgomery County. It's usually Howard County. If it's not, it's Baltimore, it's Prince George. So in terms of that question, that's great, and I completely agree with that. But when we look at school records, individualized education plans, they're supposed to be for both psychological and behavioral or academic. We're not seeing that. They're not doing it in the schools. And the individuals that are doing a lot of these assessments are not clinicians. So we have disparity even among just in Maryland, in different jurisdictions, how we do things. I think it should be done, but oftentimes they're not doing it, and it has a lot to do with what jurisdiction you're in.
So you're speaking about the IEP, is that what they call it?
Yeah, the Individualized Education Plan.
Okay. Can you, for those of us, especially in the black community, when we hear the word mental health, we look at it as if it's something bad or negative, or it means you're crazy. Something's wrong with you. Can you kind of like give us a better understanding of what it is and clear up the air for us?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, that is pervasive ideologies among communities of color. Because I'm Hispanic or Latina, and our community believes the same thing. I think that a lot of, and because there's this underlining tone that, you know, if you talk to someone, you're crazy, or you're telling someone your secrets, or you can't handle, somehow it's been changed in terms of there's some deficit with you, that you can't process that alone, that you have to go to somebody else. So I think we need to start normalizing that people get down, that people get depressed, they get anxious, sort of. We go through things. Where are you processing that? So now, remember how I told you that child that walks around with that pit? Well, adults are walking around with that because they don't want to talk to anybody, because they think, you know, they're going to be perceived a certain way. I think the stigma of mental illness in general, I think it's something we're constantly fighting. I think that individuals, once the minute you seek treatment, the minute you start talking, this is an analogy I always give individuals, right? So think about life in terms of mentally in your head. There's a file cabinet, okay? And within that file cabinet, you are able to store away certain experiences. So, you know, when you were incarcerated, things that happened when you were young, anything traumatic, right? If you don't learn how to take those traumas, those experiences, and put them away, you're constantly, it's like this mental and physical, psychologically, you're walking around with this bag.
Right.
And that bag is heavy. So to be able to take some of that and unload it, it doesn't mean that it goes away, right?
Okay.
But you're able to go, oh, okay, wait, let me take this out. Okay, let me talk about it. And then you're able to put it back in. To be able to do that, like if people think they're already functioning at a quote unquote good level and they have a history of trauma, if they're able to compartmentalize that and put that away, whatever you're doing, it's going to be even better. So if we present it that way, in sense of, let me help you so that you can learn to process this trauma and overall be able to function at a higher level.
Okay.
So that, to me, that's always the analogy I give, sort of how do you help people put some of that trauma away so that they can bring it back when they need to, when they have to process it, but not be constantly walking around with it. Because people walk around with it, they just don't know that. They manifest it differently. They're irritable, they're angry, different symptomologies that we think are just, you know, something just happened right now. Usually, and I can tell you this from working in the emergency room, people would say, well, what was a precipitant? What brought the person in today? Which is good to know, right? But the today is important to know. But what happened that brought them to today? Because it's usually not the big things for some individuals. It's all the little things that weren't processed that brought you to this day.
Right.
So being able to look at it from that perspective.
Okay. Please, you can call in with your questions at 301-429-9247. 301-429-9247. I have another question from Facebook.
Okay.
It says, Miss Cruz, what type of societal changes do you think need to happen to make mental well-being be more of a priority and address the stigmas associated with mental health? I think we kind of like went through that, but.
So I think that unfortunately, in our society, we are very reactive instead of proactive.
Okay.
So I think that we need to, if we want to take it to a bigger level in terms of legislative changes and making sure that a lot of communities are included, I think we need to look at the dollar, right?
Okay.
So we spend more money treating individuals that seek the system when they're, you know, having crises versus maintaining them in the community. So if we're able to show that if you invest this much money, so you're going to be putting out more money right now, but in the long run, we're going to be getting a kickback, a bigger kickback as society. So if we work on implementing programs now, having mentorship programs,
Okay.
making certain individual and group therapies accessible to individuals. If we implement that now, I think if we're able to show that we're able to save more money by being proactive and putting the programs in place now, addressing mental illness, breaking it down, instead of looking at it afterwards, I think that would really help.
Yeah.
But I think when we're talking about anything society, I think there's a lot of infrastructure in place that to start unpacking that, there's trauma within the infrastructure of how this country was built, is being
Absolutely.
built, is being shaped.
Absolutely. Is there specific treatment? I'm on segment 2 now. Is there specific treatment for those affected by trauma?
So, again, it depends on what type of trauma it is, and it depends if it's just trauma, because what we see is for most individuals, it's usually not trauma. There's trauma in conjunction with self-medication through the form of drugs or alcohol. There could be medical conditions, because we know, right, in terms of there's an ACE study. It's ACE, the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire. It's 10 questions. It asks you, some of the questions are, have you ever had a parent incarcerated? Did you ever witness domestic violence? So there's 10 questions, came out in the 1980s. Kaiser Permanente did it. What they realized was that anyone who had, you tally it up, anything above a 4 was indicative of trauma. Anything above a 6 was indicative of acute trauma. Most of my clients are ranging 8 to 9, right? And what Kaiser Permanente discovered was that individuals that had numbers higher than 5 were more likely to have medical conditions, heart conditions. Trauma is related physically, psychologically. So when we're looking at in terms of how to treat it, you have to sort of look at how we're assessing it. And so the ACE study is a good way to be able to see, okay, this individual scored this. But I will say this, I think that as a clinical community, we're catching up to a lot of the things that are happening societally. Philadelphia, particularly Philadelphia, just came out with the Urban ACE study. So the Urban ACE study is really good, because what they realized in the original ACE was it only targets certain populations. So there's nothing there about community violence. There's nothing there about the migration narrative. So it's more encompassing of communities of color. So I think the assessments that we use, we just need to make sure that they're culturally competent.
Got you.
Did I answer your question? That was a lot. Did I?
Yeah, you answered my question. This is
what assessment? Oh, what treatment? I went like this. I apologize. It depends. I do want to say this. It should be one of the best treatments that we have for trauma is cognitive behavioral therapy.
I did that.
Yep, it's cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT.
CBT.
So, and then if an individual has acute trauma, it's trauma-focused CBT. So for your audience, CBT essentially is if you can change someone's thoughts, you can change their behavior.
And also change how I perceive.
Yes.
Because
so we call those distortions.
Yeah, because I went and I recognize, trust me, I probably need you. I probably need to come see you, because listen, those of us who went through certain things in our lives, we see things a certain way.
Yep.
If you notice, I always back my car in. I back my car in because when I was in the streets, if I need to roll out, I could easily roll out. I have my female friends with me. I said, hey, listen, I don't pull in. You got to back in. So when I was talking to my therapist, it's like, well, if I can change your perception of the threat, because I'm only doing it just in case a threat comes about. So she's like, if I can change your perception of the threat, then my behavior and my response to it would be different. And I find that in a lot of things throughout my whole day, I'd be like, you know what? Maybe he wasn't really talking to me like that. So I'm trying to change my perception of what I see. So yeah, I went through that.
And that's hard, because you've been living with those perceptions
all my life.
So the challenge, like cognitive distortions, that's tough. To really, because with the cognitive distortions, you have defense mechanisms.
Right.
So it's your way of being able to protect yourself and protect those ideologies that you have. But in terms of how we really treat it, the best form of treatment would be CBT. Trauma-focused CBT, if it's really comprehensive, complex trauma that we're talking about.
So let's move. Okay, I'm going to ask you this one more question. Is there any relationship between trauma and the criminal justice system? Because I want to go right into this criminal justice system, and this took me right where I was getting ready to go at. Is there any relationship between trauma and the criminal justice system?
Oh, I like this question. This question, though, is completely like opening up a Pandora's box.
Okay. It's a loaded question.
It is a load. Where do I begin, right?
Right.
But I want to start off, there's a couple of things in terms of the relationship. One, I think that individuals have that aren't familiar with the criminal justice system think that there is a rehabilitative component to the criminal justice system, and there is not.
None.
There is nothing rehabilitative about what I've realized in my numerous years of doing criminal defense is if you didn't have a mental illness, prior to coming into the Department of Corrections or being involved with the criminal justice system, you're going to have one when you leave. Right? The way, even just at its basic, when individuals go into the system, and we're talking about incarceration, right? The minute they go into the system, you're no longer your name.
You're not.
You're an ID number. So we've degraded you to the point that we've stripped you of your name, and now we're identifying you as a number. So we take away a lot of the human aspect of an individual.
Absolutely.
We tell them when to go to the bathroom. We tell them what to eat. So the trauma that even comes with that, and what I'm discussing right there in particular is institutionalization, which is what happens to individuals that have been in for an extensive period of time. They become accustomed to the infrastructure that's in place. But just because there's an infrastructure doesn't mean that it's rehabilitative.
Okay.
And so when we're talking about sort of how the link between trauma and the criminal justice system, we have to talk about the number of individuals that are incarcerated. So I pulled, this is from the FBI, and these are statistics. They do it every year. We don't have the ones yet for 2018. This is for 2017. 68.9% of individuals arrested were white. 27.2% were black or African American. 18.1% were Hispanic or Latino. When we look at, so the incarceration rates are up, the detention rates. But when you look at how many individuals commit crimes, whites committed 5 million, over 5 million. African Americans committed over 2 million. But when we look at our prison system, it's individuals of color. So other Caucasians are being arrested at a higher rate.
But they're not incarcerated at the same rate.
So then we have to start talking about the trauma of really not having money, because we're talking about public defenders. We're talking about, attorneys that will take plea bargains because they have 40 other cases, because they just met their client 5 minutes ago. So when we're looking at these numbers, we have to start asking ourselves, right? Why is it that we have this population overly represented in the criminal justice system? And I recently had a conversation with someone that was really interesting about the criminal justice system. And they said to me, what do you think about everything that Trump is doing with immigration? Because now individuals are being detained with federal charges when you have illegal reentry. So the second time you come in, that's a federal offense. So you're going to be doing 3 to 10 years, right? Give or take. So are we ushering in a new wave of inmates?
Of mass incarceration.
So it's just, we usher them in and out. And so I think that when we are looking at the criminal justice system, we really have to look at the racial disparities. And individuals say, well, how are we still addressing that? How are we addressing that now? And I said, we haven't addressed it then. We still have books from Reagan, from 1980. We still have on the books the disparity between crack and cocaine.
That's right.
So we're addressing it now, and I was like, should I discuss this? I didn't want to discuss this, but I'm going to say it real quick because I think it's traumatic, right?
You could discuss whatever you want on my show.
The opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic is not new.
Right.
It just hit a different population.
I agree.
There's nothing new about it. The trauma of addiction has always been there. We don't have anything. We don't have, if an individual overdoses from crack, from PCP, we don't have anything to treat them, but we can treat them for heroin. So I think we have to start looking at sort of the racism and the infrastructure in place with that. There's 2 other things that I want to talk about the criminal justice system in terms of the link with trauma. And there's many.
Okay.
But I want to narrow it down to 2. The way that we treat our juvenile offenders.
Let's talk about it.
So we have juvenile lifers. So we're essentially saying, because if I told you that we're going to gauge you based on what you did under the age of 18, a lot of us are going to say, but I've changed.
Right.
By default.
Right.
Even now, the presumption is clinically in the scientific community that the brain is malleable and stops developing until the mid-20s. But NIH is now saying, no, it's longer. So we took somebody that their frontal cortex isn't fully developed yet.
Correct.
That they don't, they know that it might be wrong, but they can't make that connection. They are impulsive by default. Adolescents, right?
Absolutely.
We're saying that what you committed, and I'm not here, I don't want people to think that I'm advocating that And if individuals do a certain crime, I believe that you should go through the criminal justice system.
Right.
But we also have to look at how we are imposing
I
and
agree.
how we're treating our juvenile lifers.
I agree.
And so now we have juvenile lifers, and we're fighting for, you know, life with parole, without parole. So that's just one of the traumas, right? Because you have a 13-year-old. I had a client, we're going to call him Juan. He was 13 and a half, and he was sentenced as an adult. He was charged as an adult, and by the time we went to court, he was 15. This kid maybe weighed 110 pounds. He looked like he was 13. So you just put him in prison with pedophiles, with all types of individuals, and you have a child. So the trauma that comes with that, when we sentence juveniles. And then another one is, which I think people don't think about, right? So when a loved one passes away, there's rituals attached to that grief, right? You go to the cemetery, you go to the vigil, you're able to process and grieve with your loved ones. It's a form of closure. But when you're incarcerated, you can't do that.
Yeah, that touches home, because I lost my mom when I was incarcerated, and I was in pre-release.
Did they let you go? And you were in pre-release.
I was in pre-release.
Yep.
They did not let me go, and had the balls to come to my bunk the next morning and tell me I had to go out on road crew. I mean, I'm looking at this dude like, y'all won't let me go see my mother.
Yep.
But you gonna come on my bunk and ask me to go out to, have you lost your goddamn mind?
Yep.
And like you say, as far as closure, like even with me when it comes to my mom, I haven't had closure.
No.
So I don't want to see pictures of her now. I don't want to really like to talk about her. Till this day, I still cry like it happened that day. You know what I mean? So that is a trauma right there that many, especially in Maryland, you can't go see your loved one.
We have taken motions. We have gone to court. Not a single one of my clients that has had their loved one pass away but they've been incarcerated have been allowed to go to the funerals.
And so that's a trauma right there. That's
a compounded trauma. The trauma of losing your loved one, the trauma. And then let's talk about the prison mass, right? So most individuals are told that their loved ones passed away, and then you're put back in general population.
Yeah.
So how are you processing that? So and just think about sort of the, losing a loved one. Just if I had $1 for my clients that say,
and we talking about a mother.
Yes, and they'll say the minute I get out, I'm going to go to her grave. The minute I go out, I'm going to do, because you're stuck psychologically. You weren't able to properly grieve that loss. And that's just one. I mean, I can give you many different types. So the intersection between the criminal justice system and trauma, it's there. If like I said, if you didn't have trauma, which I doubted, going into the system, you're going to have it coming out. There is this podcast, if you want to know about sort of the institutional trauma and sort of embedded in our criminal justice system. It's called Serial, Seril. Sarah Keegan. So it's season 3. She's focusing on Cleveland, Ohio, and their criminal justice system. Your audience is going to get a little teed off when they listen to it because it's heavy to listen to. But there you really see sort of the injustices. So we're there's already trauma, and then we're re-traumatizing individuals with our own legal justice system.
Right. So back to the juvenile lifers, as you know, my best friend Irk, that's my man. So we've been fighting in Annapolis to try to get them to understand that, first off, we fighting because life with parole, you should be getting parole, right? Now, me personally, I don't think that no juvenile should be sentenced to life because of what you said, exactly what you said. First off, our maturity level is not there. It's not there. What do you think about the way we sentence our juveniles to life? Like, some of them have life without parole. How do you think we should handle, like, let's say I killed someone. How do you think this should be addressed? Because I got to go to jail. Absolutely, I have to go to jail. But what do you think would be fair, or what do you think should be happening while I'm behind bars? So
I think we're one of the very few developed countries that sentence juveniles to life.
Okay.
And in a lot of countries, this isn't even allowed. We wouldn't even be having this discussion. So I think that when we're talking about juvenile lifers, one of the things, and I think there is, individuals have this conception that a crime was committed, someone has to pay for it. And I think that you have to take into account mitigating factors.
Okay.
Sort of that individual's background. Some individuals, will have very different backgrounds that will allow you to mitigate the case a certain way. But I think to do life without the possibility of parole, or to sentence a juvenile to the death penalty, to do anything in terms of that, you are taking away someone's, at their core, the basic belief that maybe they could get out. I think they become a bigger risk to society when we tell them, this is all that you are. This is all that we see you for. Mm-hmm. There is no redemption there. Mm-hmm. We have a very hard time sitting with redemption, thinking that people can change, that they can evolve. Mm-hmm. So I think that when you are talking about juvenile lifers, I think that we have to take into account how they were, sort of all the circumstances around that. And I think that it really has to be on a case by case. But if you're asking me personally and professionally, I don't believe that juveniles should get charged with life. I think that we need to take into account how old someone is. We take into account someone's mental illness. We have not criminally responsible in the state of Maryland. Mm-hmm. So we take that into account. We rehabilitate them in that sense, but our juvenile lifers don't get that. And I think that if you are going to sentence a juvenile, you have to put an infrastructure into place so that we can treat juveniles. So we have Patuxent, Youthful Offender Program.
Been there before.
Which is great, but there's not, in terms of beds, there's not enough beds for the demand.
Yeah.
And then once you put them back into general population, developmentally, right? Just, you're talking about a boy or a girl that's 16 or 17 in a room doing therapy with individuals in their 40s or 50s. What are you sharing?
Right.
So I think that putting into place systems that can really handle these very specialized populations, like juveniles.
Gotcha.
Individuals of different cultures, different, sexual orientation, all of that I think needs to be considered.
Okay. We got 13 minutes. Is there anything that you want to definitely make sure that our viewers hear from you?
Yes, I think one of the main things, so I talk a lot about trauma. It's what I'm a trauma expert, and I think that this year the position that I wanted to take was, I really want individuals to look at trauma in terms of, so post-traumatic stress happens, and so how do we deal with that in terms of not allowing or not letting the client stay with that trauma narrative in terms of all the deficits that come with it. Right. By that I mean, I really want, and I challenge individuals to look at, because it's hard if I tell you, from every traumatic experience, we learn something. Looking at it in terms of, what do you learn from that trauma narrative? Because for me, I think clinically, the way that we can really help clients is by building resiliency. So if you think about someone who has been around a lot of trauma, who's experienced trauma, firsthand, secondhand, the skill sets that you learn when you are in an environment like that, you learn to compartmentalize, you learn to prioritize, you learn to scan a room, good or bad, but these are all qualities, right?
Absolutely.
How do we take those qualities and show a child that you can become resilient despite what your trauma narrative is? So I tell students this, I tell colleagues this, I tell my clients this, my job is to help you clinically so that you can look at yourself, all the trauma that you've experienced, and change your trauma narrative from that of victim to that of survivor.
Okay.
So I think looking at it in terms of, how do we grow from that trauma, which is hard because most individuals say, I didn't grow from this trauma, but you did, because you became more resilient. Mm-hmm. You learned how to cope. You learned how to thrive in chaos. So how do we we pluck from that and put that in different areas in someone's life? I have a really good quote that I wanted to share with your audience. And that quote says, it says, "After all, when a stone is dropped into a pond, the water continues quivering even after the stone has sunk to the bottom." That's from Memoirs of a Geisha.
Okay.
But the reason why I like this quote is because I think it's synonymous with trauma, right? So here you have the stone and you throw it into the pond, and it might sink all the way to the bottom, but it still ripples. It's still there. So you might be able to suppress it. We look at that stone in terms of trauma. You might be able to suppress it either in a positive or in a negative format by drugs or alcohol, by therapy, so there's positive and negative ways of processing that. And that stone hits the bottom, i.e. you're able to suppress it. It's still going to have effects. Mm-hmm. It still has interpersonal effects. It still affects attachment. It still affects the way you view the world. So being able to, how do we acknowledge that that stone is there? And how do we bring it to the forefront so that we can help clients grow from that? So we can help our loved ones grow from that. And I think that one of the things that I also want to leave your audience with is sort of how do we as a community, what can we as a community do? And I think we really need to educate ourselves. We need to educate ourselves on what the risks are, what the protective factors are. We need to know what someone's baseline is. People don't talk enough about the baseline.
What is baseline?
So the baseline is your clinical functioning. So all of us have a baseline, sort of
how you act,
how you operate, right? The baseline goes like this. So anytime something traumatic happens, it can go up and down. So you're incarcerated, your baseline shifts.
Okay. When
you're deployed, your baseline shifts. So when the individual assimilates back into society from incarceration, from deployment, from being sick, from anything, when they reintegrate back into society, your baseline is shifted. All those around you, do they even know your baseline shifted? Or are they just expecting you to function the way you were before? Because that's traumatic. Vets, you have a vet that's coming back and it's near the holidays and it's the 4th of July and the family's going like, let's go see the fireworks. That baseline of that vet has changed because they witnessed and they experienced and they heard something. So that fireworks could trigger their trauma. Right? So that baseline becomes important. And the only way we know someone's baseline is by knowing the individual. Like knowing what the baseline is. If I know your baseline is you take naps 1 hour out of the day. I'm just hypothetically saying this, right? And all of a sudden you start taking 2 or 3 naps. Your baseline, something's going on. So being aware, because the only way that we can implement protective factors is by knowing if there's anything going on. So understanding what the baseline really is for individuals.
Right.
And treating them that way.
Okay, let me see. I got another question.
Okay.
How do we advocate for services for those affected?
I think that sometimes individuals get stuck on a client, a person, an idea. I think that we need to look at it more globally. And the way that we look at it more globally, the way that we can reach more individuals is we have to fight legislatively. You have to use your right to vote. You have to know what bills are being put out there. You have to know the rhetoric that the politicians are using. You have to understand sort of what's on the line. So the way that we help populations is by knowing what the needs are. So if we know that in our community the need is we need more trauma-informed therapists, then we need to make sure we have grants so that agencies can get these grants so that their clinicians can become trauma-informed. So I think looking at it in terms of, yes, I'm going to help this one client, but how do I help many clients? And I think the way that we can collectively do that is by staying involved with legislation, knowing what bills are being put out there, and really knowing what's going on. I think education, I think individuals have a really hard time. Every time I can talk about sexual trauma, I can talk about different things, and people understand that. But when you talk about offender rights, or you talk about discrimination, or you talk about certain subjects that are just make people uncomfortable, all of a sudden we don't understand. So I think we need to stop being comfortable with being uncomfortable and really start having conversations.
Okay.
That's the way I think we're really going to start addressing things.
I know there's domestic violence. I know we only have a few minutes left. What could you say? What kind of advice could you give to someone that may be in an abusive relationship right now and feel like they don't have no way out?
So I think one of the things that people need to realize is there is what in the domestic violence arena, there is the cycle of violence. So what happens is you have the tension building, and then you have the actual aggression, then you have the honeymoon stage, and it circulates. So right now that person could be in the honeymoon stage or the tension building stage, but it's a pendulum. It's going to come back. So the minute, for the most part, right? The minute an individual crosses that line and there's domestic violence, the probability of it happening again, it's always there. And I think that when you're talking about domestic violence, individuals need to know this, and I think this might this is a very controversial law that passed in October 2017. Now, with domestic violence laws, what we realized is it's more traumatic for individuals to hear trauma than to see it. Because, and this is all coming related to domestic violence. When an individual is seeing domestic violence, a child is seeing it, it can be horrible, but you're seeing it. You're not adding a visual element to it. But when you're just hearing it, you're hearing this. That could visually you're putting your own. So it's worse to hear it than to actually see it. And so based on all the research that we've done, and a lot of this is coming from post-traumatic stress disorder with the DSM-5, they've now implemented, and they're on the books, new domestic violence laws in which if a woman exposes her children to domestic violence, like her children witness it, they hear it, legally they can now come after her too.
What?
Which is very controversial, and I don't agree with it, because it's the whole cycle of violence, right? And so most women stay, but some women,
so they expect, so I guess what they're saying, they trying to force you that if it happens to get out.
To get out.
That's sad that they would have to even implement that law, but I'm not a woman. I never been through it. I never beat anyone, so I don't know mentally and psychologically what it's like to feel like I gotta stay.
With the domestic violence, I think this is some of the, and with some of the clients that I've seen, it's another one where you can have individuals where they are extremely successful in this one sub area of their life. But when it comes to interpersonal, they could be engaged in a relationship and you would never think that where the spouse is domineering or they control certain aspects of it. So I think that when we're looking at domestic violence, it can happen to any woman. They'll say, oh, not me. Oh, I wouldn't put up with that. Or I wouldn't do that. There's different forms of domestic violence. There's financial.
Financial domestic violence?
Financial one is real.
What is that?
That's when your significant other, because women can do it too, right? We always think of the aggressor as the male. That's when one of the partners will completely dominate the finances. Like I would say, you have a $5 allowance. That's it. That's all you can use.
Gotcha.
So there's the financial piece, there's a psychological, there's the emotional. Domestic violence spreads the gamut, and what we know is that the kids witness, what they hear, like that lingers and stays with them.
All right. Before we go, can you give them your web address again?
Yes, I have two. So my company one for forensics is www.cruzassociates.org. And my personal one in terms of my presenting and my continuing education is www.veronicacruz.com.
So if you have a loved one that is incarcerated, loved one that may have a life sentence, or may be facing a life sentence, you have a loved one that may be doing a post-conviction, these are things that you can help in as far as putting together what?
Yes, so I specifically, we specialize in putting together comprehensive biopsychosocial assessments with a reentry component, mitigating the case so that the individual will be seen for not just their charges, but the totality of who they are.
Got you. Question for you. So I have an 8-year-old, right? In terms of discipline, right? What would you suggest as a form of discipline? I ain't talking about beating him or nothing like that. I'm just saying when he acts up in school, right? I don't want to come at him and it be so traumatic and it damages him. How do you suggest that we handle?
So is the 8-year-old using cell phones or Wi-Fi or anything like that? So this is what I found to be one of the most effective things with children, right? Not putting your hands on them, but taking away that Wi-Fi password. Because unfortunately, our kids are very connected to technology, whether it be games, so I think that it's still punitive in nature because you're taking away something from them because they did something. So I would wager, like if you do this, I'm gonna take away the Wi-Fi password because then they can't get on.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's been effective. That's what.
Okay. Well, look like we come to the end. We do no commercials. Hey, it was one of those shows. Any last thoughts? We got 1 minute. Anything?
No, I just want to say, just remember the brain is malleable. People can change. We can adapt. We're not defined by the worst act that we've committed.
I thank you so much for coming on the show. We probably will have to do a part 2, not this week, the following week. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
That's it for our show today. Join us next week. We're going to have Miss Mahasan come on. She is the Prince George's County Circuit Court Clerk elected. We're going to have Eric Byring, who is the District 24 legislator, come on next week. So tune in next week. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.